Good afternoon, Nation of Fight fans. It's your God Emperor, Jack Slack. And this is the Fights Gone By podcast, episode 41. We're entering another one of those periods where there's going to be a UFC event every week for 8 weeks. And when we have breaks in the events, I always miss these times when there's an event every week. And then when we have these events every week, I always think, oh God, these events aren't even good enough to write about ahead of time. So, grass is always greener in this business. Been an eventful week in England. Sun's out again, which is good. We had a general election, which was hilarious at least. And as for me, all I've been doing is trainee, Jackie and Slacky. But we had a fight card, which was Hunt versus Lewis, and that was passable. Decent, actually. I'd say decent, yeah. I need to start a star system for these because whenever I say something's a decent night of fights, someone gets upset about it. Decent is my one-size-fits-all term for wasn't remarkably bad. But yeah, we've got that to talk about. And then might skip over talking about Correia versus Holm because that is a match of almost no importance. I can't believe they're trying to sell that as a main event at this point. But at any rate, let's do some news. The Mayweather-McGregor thing, I've got written down here in my show plan, Mayweather versus McGregor, ongoing bullshit. I could just paste this into everyone every single week, to be honest. Mayweather allegedly booked out a venue for the 26th of August, I believe it was. Then that turned out not to be true. And in the time between that being announced and it being announced to not be true, I got a dozen tweets of people saying, "Ha! Knew it would happen, told you, Jack." Could well happen. But you know how Floyd Mayweather is. Every step of this process is going to be theatre. Think about how long it took to get Pacquiao and Mayweather together. When it was like people didn't care about, like Maidana, the first Maidana fight, that was signed easy peasy. But when there's actual interest in it, you've got to hype it up and do the will they, won't they thing. And to be honest, they could or they could not. So. It just astounds me how many people are interested in this completely pointless match. I can't guarantee anything one way or the other. Can't even guarantee that Mayweather would win if they matched up. But I can guarantee you that the marketing for this fight will be almost unbearable. It will be MMA versus boxing and blah, blah, blah. And it's going to make you want to shoot yourself in the face. And at every stage, I'm feeling guilty because the more this bullshit drags on, the more people read my book, which is great because that's what I wanted. I wanted people to read it. But this is also the stupidest fight of all time. And it feels a little bit like being a war profiteer. The guilt that I have simultaneous. But moving on to actual news. Bruce Lee, interesting piece of footage came out this week. Bruce Lee in a quote-unquote real fight with his top student, Teddy Wong. They're both padded up. It's like a demonstration of full-contact sparring at one of those Long Beach karate shows in the 70s or 60s, whichever. It's just dragged up all the usual Bruce Lee stuff. He looked really sharp in it, really fast, but also the guy was just feeding him one jab at a time very slowly so that he could do nice counters and be like, check out my sick sparring. Anytime this sort of stuff comes up, it's agony because there's people who are like, Bruce Lee not a fighter at all, and then there's other people who are like, and people say Conor McGregor could beat this guy. Actual comment I read on YouTube today with dozens of upvotes or likes or whatever. Just absolutely bizarre. And then I read his reasoning when someone replied, yeah, of course they would. So would numerous other MMA fighters. And that's, even that is being generous to Bruce Lee. I think every trained MMA fighter would beat Bruce Lee in a fight because he wasn't a trained fighter. Well, he was a trained martial artist, but he wasn't a trained fighter. And, he had very, very limited experience with the ground game. But this guy responded, yeah, in the cage maybe, but in a real fight. These people who still think that a real fight means that the other guy can't just grab a hold of you and body slam you. Absolutely bizarre. Anyway, on to fight news. Ryzen announced an interesting fight this week. Saiga, is it Keizamon Saiga? The guy from the great fight with Ersan Yamamoto, which I think is probably the best one I've seen Ryzen put together so far. Really interesting kickboxing style. Uses a lot of front leg snap kicks to the body and a really nice jab. against Tenshin Natsukawa, who is, of course, the Japanese super kid, the Wunderkind of striking sports. The downside is this would be great as a kickboxing match. This would be great as an MMA match. But Ryzen has decided to do special rules, which is alternate rounds. You remember? And I've never seen a fight that benefited from special rules. We all remember Shinya Aoki getting knocked out by a flying knee against the cosplaying kickboxer. And we all remember Bob Sapp in the between the MMA round and the kickboxing round against Jerome Labana crying as they tried to change his gloves in the corner. And I think Katsunori Kikuno had a mixed rules one too at some point. But like none of those fights benefited from being a mixed rules fight. And if you're going strict mixed rules and you're changing the gloves midway through, that just makes everything far more complicated anyway. Yeah, really stupid, but that's Japanese MMA in a nutshell. Sorry, I legit yawned over that, and I'm not re-recording it. Also in Rising News, just going full freak show here, because they keep signing professional wrestlers. Well, there's a great history of signing professional wrestlers with no fighting experience to fight each other, or fight Gabby Garcia in Japan. They are trying to sign Kota Ibushi, who is a guy who got an offer from the WWE, a pro wrestler got an offer from the WWE, and then decided he wanted to do his own thing. And the last I saw of him, he was firing fireworks at his own chest on top of a car in Newcastle. But yeah, very, very talented pro wrestler. Apparently has kickboxing experience, but like, why? Why? Anyway. Also, he suffered a really badly broken neck like 2 years ago and almost had to end his career. So, not sure I want to see him fighting off guillotines or anything like that. And then the real big news this week is that Bellator have hired Mike Goldberg and Mauro Ranallo, which is a huge catch for them. I have a love-hate relationship with Scott Coker because a lot of what he does is just manipulative bullshit. But his genius is in making Bellator more legit without actually doing much to make the fights better. I mean, they've got some better fighters there now, like Larkin and Rory McDonald, and their whole welterweight division is actually pretty interesting. But most of what he does is just draw in MMA fans who are like lapsed MMA fans. You know, if you've been around MMA for any time in the last 20 years, there have always been those guys starting threads on forums being like, the UFC's not what it used to be. And today that's like before the Reebok deal, or before Conor, or before Moneyweight. But like, there's been stages all along the way where people are like, oh, MMA's just wrestling now, or MMA since they added the gloves, or just people whining constantly. And they are the sort of people who are easily dragged in by like Ken Shamrock fighting at the age of 50. But, you know, I love Mauro Ranallo. He's the best commentator in the game, in my opinion, my humble opinion, because he does effortlessly switch between boxing and wrestling and all these things, and he actually knows his stuff in all of those sports. Mike Goldberg, meanwhile, is not very good at his job. And like, he's been made into this saint since the UFC fired him, because the UFC were a bit harsh in keeping him around for so long and then just sort of cutting him, but without a word said, or like a tribute or anything. Now, if the UFC had been clever, they'd have done what the WWE did, or does, with its talent, and they'd have copyrighted all his catchphrases. Because basically, what Scott Coker has paid for is the "here we go" and the "it's all over," and maybe the occasional meteoric rise or "you want to be a fighter." But if they'd done that, if the UFC had copyrighted those and then Goldberg couldn't use them without being there, that would have been good. Like how Cody Rhodes can't be Cody Rhodes. He has to be Cody or Cody Runnels. Because Dusty Rhodes sold the Rhodes name to the WWE. But you know the strangest thing? This is going to work. People like the familiar blanket that they're used to, and Mike Goldberg is like a little keepsake thing. You know, I like the comfort of hearing those same three phrases said over and over again. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that works out. I do wish Mike Goldberg all the luck in the world, because he does genuinely seem to like MMA. He's just not the best at commentating it. Anyway, we've got some recaps to do now. So the main event of the weekend's card was Darren Lewis versus Mark Hunt, and that fight really summed up the difference between... Well, what I like about the heavyweight division is that the technical and strategic level is so much lower than like the lightweight or featherweight divisions. But when you see a heavyweight fight clever over like a 5-round fight, the last 2-3 rounds are going to be all him because of the strategic, because of the strategy that he employed throughout. It's one where, because the action's slower and the quality is lower, you get to see how much of a difference a little bit of ringcraft makes. And this fight was just Mark Hunt showing the double jab, never hitting with it, showing the double jab, getting Derrick Lewis to the fence, and then Derrick Lewis would try and swing off the fence when he realised he was on the fence, and Mark Hunt would back off, step back in, and Derrick Lewis would panic again. And for the early going, it was like Hunt was trying to step in with the double jab on the fence and line up the right hand, but he wasn't really having much success with it. He had basically the first 2 rounds with Derrick Lewis tiring himself out, swinging off the fence, which was like the Raymond Daniels answer to getting cornered. If you don't understand how to circle out, just throw as hard as you can and hope that the other guy backs off. That's him making an error. Well, not necessarily, because you can back off and then step in again afterwards, and that'll tire them out anyway. But for them to let up the pressure is basically like you're relying on them choosing to do that. If they just put their gloves up or whatever and then start throwing back, you're throwing from a position of disadvantage. So I did live commentary not live commentary for this, but I did commentary for my first watch through of this fight and Hooker versus Pearson, which you can watch on this YouTube channel, on the YouTube channel. I don't know if you're listening to this on iTunes or whatever, but go to the Jack Slack YouTube channel and we've got the live commentaries up. I'm going to be trying to do those for more events, as I promised. And throughout the fight I was going, I'd really like to see Hunt going to the body along the fence here rather than the just swinging for the head. And then he started doing it. He started going right hand to the body, left hook to the body. As Lewis was circling out towards his right, he'd hit the right straight to the body, and that really winded Lewis badly. He started to gas very apparently. Sip of tea, bear with me. Yeah, the thing about Derrick Lewis in this fight was that, and this is what really bummed me out, he retired after the fight, and I hope he's not for real, because these are the kind of performances that make the difference for a fighter with the athletic ability, but not necessarily the smarts. You know, when you were watching him throw up jumping switch kicks for 3 rounds, as a 260-pound man, you know, he's a giant, and he's throwing up these switch kicks, and they look fairly decent. You know, he's turning his hips into them. And I was watching on my live commentary. I was like, Hunt. It would be good to see Hunt stepping inside these, but it's quite a lot to ask to have the guy take these kicks on his forearm and then step inside. He's throwing these kicks that look like they could easily break an arm, and he's jumping up and doing them for 3 rounds, no questions asked. You know, people are talking about how bad his gas tank is, but it was his awful decision making that ruined his gas tank in this fight. He was happily throwing up these jump kicks for 2.5-3 rounds with very little difficulty. And that is a sign of tremendous athletic potential in a guy of that size. If you paired that with a savvier fight IQ, he'd be a real force. And I was hoping that this fight would do that for him. You know, having watched in the moments between the end of the fight and him announcing his retirement, I was like, yeah, he could grow from this. This would be great. But no, apparently he's retired now. Apparently his back's mullered as well. But this is the thing about dudes of that size. You know, Shane Carwin had this too. Well, the obvious example of extremes is Andre the Giant. But you have these guys who are nearing 300 pounds, 6'5", 6'6", 6 foot whatever, and they're, you know, it's almost too heavy for their own good. Like we are now as humans growing too big for what we can actually support. You know, the giant guy with the back difficulties or the knee difficulties is just the repeating story in like sports which with heavier dudes like basketball and the NFL and so on. Which is why, as not a heavyweight, it's always nice to think after you've had like a bad roll with a really big guy, you go, well, his back's going to give out before mine. But yeah, so it's pretty bad to hear that about Derrick Lewis. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to paint this performance as if it was a work of genius, but it was that cautious Mark Hunt which I really like seeing. I mean, still the best fight to me in Hunt's career, spanning kickboxing and MMA, is the Roy Nelson fight, because you were seeing Mark Hunt, a guy who got into kickboxing and made it to the highest levels of kickboxing through his chin and his hands alone. He was surprisingly quick, but he wasn't very technical, And a lot of the time, his big wins, like Jerome Labana and Ray Safo, he got those by drawing those guys into brawls, by dropping his hands and saying, come at me, and then hitting them as they did. Whereas against Roy Nelson and Darren Lewis and a lot of these guys nowadays, he's coming in against guys whose physical attributes are every bit as good as his when they were in his prime, when he was in his prime, but he doesn't have that anymore. He's been knocked out several times. He can't rely on just taking the punches anymore. And Derrick Lewis could take Hunt's punches, and Derrick Lewis hits every bit as hard as Mark Hunt, and so does Roy Nelson. And Roy Nelson's chin is amazing too. So in those two fights, you really got to see Hunt. That he learned something over those 20 years in kickboxing and MMA. And those are the ones that made me feel really good and appreciate Hunt as a fighter. So I don't know what's next for Mark Hunt. I don't really want to see him. Well, God, I mean, there's always the chance that they put him in with Stipe if someone gets injured. But to be honest, I'd be happy to watch Mark Hunt just whoop on inexperienced heavyweight prospects. They're talking about maybe Ngannou next, but, well, either way, I mean, Ngannou hits very hard, but he is extremely inexperienced. There's not a lot been tested about Ngannou. And then for Derrick Lewis, I just hope he comes back. But, this is that duality of being a fight fan. I don't want anyone to carry on longer than they... it's almost nice when a guy retires early because, so many guys... I'm so used to seeing guys get beaten until their brains are basically scrambled eggs and then they retire at 40-something. It'd be nice if he stuck to it, but also as someone with an eye for potential, I see a tremendous amount in him, and I'd quite like to see that pushed through. Anyway, elsewhere, Bronson versus Kelly. My man Dan Kelly with his old man judo, just a little bit slow on his feet and got caught cold with a big left hand. Bronson. What can you say about the performance? I don't, there wasn't an awful lot to judge him on. He did lean his chin out again with that left hand, but he got the job done quick and he didn't run in like a flailing wild man. Ion Kutol versus Enric de Silva. This was a quick blowout. And this is where intimidation does become a factor in fights, because if you are a big scary guy and you jump on the opponent while he's cold, you can pick up those quick stoppages because guys can be overwhelmed in the early seconds. So many fighters like to get those, just take a circle of the cage or just bounce in and out a little bit, get loose and then start to work. If you jump on a guy right off the bat, you've got a great chance of catching him cold. Someone put a clip up on Reddit, which I'd forgotten even happened actually. It was Kutol versus Jared Cannoneer. Jared the Cannon. He basically, Cannoneer was hands down taking Kutolaba's swings on the head and just being like, come at me, bro, because Kutolaba does all this nonsense before the before the fight with the stare down. Didn't like that they let him walk all the way across the cage and get in the other guy's face. Seems like that's something that the referee or the commission should be stopping. As cool as it is also, all it takes is the other guy to swing back or something like that, and then suddenly you've got no fight. Actually, on the subject of Jared Cannoneer, I was watching his fight with Teixeira the other day, and a lot of people remember that as a blowout because he got taken down and held down a lot. He was working back to guard really well constantly, but in the moments on the feet, he boxed Teixeira up, and he was working 10-hour days at the airport, apparently, and trains in Alaska in the middle of nowhere. So that guy has a ton of potential if he could actually stop takedowns. But if you haven't seen that fight, it's been a while since you watched it, it was a bit of a snoozer, but go back and watch the standing bits because he makes Teixeira look very bad. So Kutol versus De Silva was a blowout very quickly. How long did that take? 22 seconds. Yeah, that's definitely catching someone cold. Ben Wynn versus Tim Elliott was... I actually recorded live commentary for this, but I felt like it was barely even worth uploading because it's just me going... telling you what to expect from both men and then being like, oh my god, he's on his back. Yeah, just incredible performance for Ben Wynn. Tim Elliott is one of those guys who's so calm that it can play against him. If you watch Roger Gracie's grappling match with Eduardo Tellez. Eduardo Tellez is a guy who plays the turtle. He's a genius, and he's a guy who really had a ceiling because he played such a weird style. But even if you watch him against guys like Keenan Cornelius looks really clueless against him because he keeps passing the guard and then getting put back in the guard because the guy just goes to the turtle and rolls. His Tellers' whole game is the turtle, and he's so calm even when guys have his back. He entered the Eddie Bravo Invitational, and he was like, I'm going to win every fight on defense. And they were like, oh, okay, because you only get paid for submissions. And he did that in the first round. He just won on defense, let the guy crawl all over him, and then won on escape times in the overtime. But he grappled Roger Gracie, and he went to his turtle, and Gracie immediately took his back. And it was sort of like, he's so calm under fire, but as you know, once that happened, he was on the back foot and reeling. So that's what I thought it looked like with Tim Elliott. He was like, okay, ho-hum, getting this guy off my back, and then suddenly the arm was under his neck. Ben Nguyen is doing great things in that division. He's a Reddit favourite because of that clip of him and Jules the Jackal. But what's he done since he got to the UFC? He's only got that loss to Lewis Smolka, who seems to be getting back on track since. Oh no, I say that he lost the one to Tim Elliott, but he looked great in that fight. But Lewis Smolka, really top tier guy at that weight. I mean, they're always looking for new fighters for Demetrius Johnson. If they're keeping that division around, throw Ben Nguyen in. I'd prefer Ben Nguyen to Ray Bork, to be honest. There was a really interesting fight on the... it's the first fight on the main card, I think. It was Volkanovski versus Hirota. Hirota, very famous for having his arm snapped by Shinya Aoki. Because of how easily Shinya Aoki passed his guard, I always assumed that Hirota was just something of a one-dimensional banger, but his guard looked all right in this fight. The case was that Hirota wouldn't get off the fence or wouldn't stay off the fence. Volkanovski would push in, get him to the fence. He'd occasionally hit this nice outside reap takedown, but more often than not, Volkanovski would start trying to work out, and he got clipped with a big right hook, leaving, the same thing that Stipe Miocic did to Junior Dos Santos. If the guy is wrestling free and circling out, there is a period where he is circling out with his hands still wrestling, and that's when you can chin him. And then he threw a couple of those back elbows from the clinch, the ones that John Jones does, where he starts dropping on towards their hips and they're trying to keep him up, and then he slides one hand across so that he's almost arm dragging himself and spins for the elbow. And that used to be like a gimmicky technique, but the more I see it, the more it makes sense, because if you've got their arms occupied in wrestling and you know that they can't back up, the time to spin for any spinning technique is when you know that they can't go backwards, because every spinning technique, the big flaw is as soon as you turn your back, if the opponent steps back, you've lost them. So I really like the back elbow. I think that could be a great thing. A couple of other interesting moments in this. I mean, the whole ground game in this fight was terrific because Volkanovski is really dynamic and Hirota was doing a good job of fighting back to guard. Really interesting thing not really interesting, but really important principle. Volkanovski knocked him down. Hirota salvages half guard and immediately dives the arm under the leg. He gets the underhook on one side and then underhooks the leg on the other side, as if to go to deep half. If you don't know what deep half is, it's where you get underneath and you straighten out one of their legs, make a lever out of it, and you can pop out the back door and stuff. But basically, deep half is getting underneath the other guy. The problem with deep half, especially if you're using it when you're rocked and trying to recover, is that as soon as you put that arm through, if the other guy sits his weight down on it, you've just got your wrist trapped between their thigh and calf, and your head is completely unprotected from elbows. Bigfoot versus Kane, Pequeno versus Aldo, tons of examples of guys getting caught in that position and just having the snot elbowed out of them. But yeah, Volkanovski looked good, promising stuff. And then the real standout performance of the night for me was Dan Hooker versus Ross Pearson. You can go and listen to my live commentary of that because I go into it I hope Hooker's been working on this stuff. And then the more Hooker does, the more I'm like, wow, he's doing really well here. And then there's that horrific knee KO. But I mean, if you want my live reaction to it, just from memory, I'm like, yeah, look how Pearson is having to lunge after him. He's controlling the distance well, and Pearson's jumping for those left hooks. I'm quite worried that he's going to eat a check hook or get countered. And then in the second round, he immediately leaps in, tries to duck a return, and ends up eating the knee. Ross Pearson is a guy who I think should be his footage should be in the library of every coach at every top gym now, because he applied boxing very well in MMA, and counterfighting particularly. But the flaws in his game were always the kicks and the range. And I really like Dan Hooker's jab in this fight too. He was using the jab flicky. You don't want to be stepping in trying to skewer Ross Pearson's head, because it's likely that you're going to either miss it completely or glance off the side, and then he's going to be on top of you throwing that left hook. Whereas in this fight, he was just Hooker was just flicking that jab out, and by the second round, Pearson wasn't trying to slip anymore. He was trying to palm that jab because it was just hacking him off so much. So Dan Hooker, one to keep the eye on there. So that'll do us for recaps. Actually, there was a really interesting thing happened in the kickboxing. Myrtle Groenhart, actually a couple of interesting things at Glory. I haven't watched the whole thing yet. I've not caught up on Doumbé versus Holskin, which I really need to. But Groenhart versus Gregorian, it was Myrtle. Someone said it happened off the flying knee. I saw the clip of the end before I saw the fight. Someone said that Gregorian got stunned by a flying knee, and I immediately, actually they just said a knee, and I immediately went, oh, that'll be that jumping Groenhart knee. Because even when I was doing my commentary for the Lewis Hunt fight, I was referring to that as the Groenhart knee, where you lift the rear leg as if to kick, and then you skip in with the lead leg with the knee up the centre. Myrtle Groenhart does that constantly, which is why I call it the Groenhart knee. But he landed a few of these on Gregorian through the fight, and in the second round, right at the start, he lands one, and it cuts Gregorian open. I've heard people say that maybe Gregorian thought the round was over or something like that, because all sorts of strange things happen when fighters get hit. You hear tons of things about fighters forgetting the round, or Tim Sylvia said he got knocked down by Randy Couture in the first round, and then the next thing he remembered was them in between the fourth and fifth round saying, "You got to win this fight, Tim." But something went wrong in his head because he immediately turned away, like he thought the ref had stopped the fight for them to check the cut or something. And Groenhart just lamps him from behind, and it's really bad KO. He goes stiff. This is always one of those ones where people are like, protect yourself at all times. Yes, protect yourself at all times. But other people are like, oh, that's a very scummy move. To let you know where I stand on it, and this applies to all the Floyd Mayweather versus Ortiz thing and all that stuff, is that this was supposed to be a grudge match. They were supposed to have real beef with each other. I don't know how I would feel personally if I felt like I was getting the better of someone and then I got the knockout by hitting them while they were turned away. It feels like that's sort of an underwhelming end to the grudge match, especially if you were winning, which Groenhart was. But this is one of those moral questions that comes up in fighting, and I'm quite glad that there is no right answer to it. It's interesting. And Mirat Gregorian, I don't know if they're related, I presume they are, but he was on the undercard of the Super Fight Series or whatever, and he was doing some interesting things, because he, one of the recent K1 Grand Prix, well, since they went bankrupt, so nobody really cares anymore, but one of the recent K1 Max Grand Prix, Gregorian, I think he won it, but he went through 3 guys in one night with head kicks, which just tells you that this is a guy like Peter Ayats. Watch how he sets up his head kicks, because he's clearly landing them a lot. It was interesting. He was moving his man to the ropes, he was putting pressure on him, and then he'd jump in with a left hook or a right straight and wait for the other guy to start swinging back, and then he'd throw a counter punch and a high kick. So he was trying to catch the guy swinging, but hit him with the high kick while he was doing it. So he was using the high kick as a counter punch, really, which was interesting, I thought. If you can, go watch that. I think it's on UFC Fight Pass. But yeah, it wasn't a bad event for Glory, because I really wasn't interested in their last one. I don't want to watch Rico Verhoeven beat up nobodies. But this was a really interesting card. So props to him. Right, let's do some questions then. Hi, Mr. Slack. Could you go a bit further about the downsides of same-side punching while you shift? You said it once on Reddit. Oh, God. I can't remember everything I say on Reddit. I mainly make snarky comments there. It's easy to see how risky shifting as a whole can be as... Oh, sorry. It's easy to see how risky shifting as a whole can be when you're vulnerable in the process, but what makes the punch on the now-to-be new lead side so impractical? Is it a matter of not being able to put as much weight behind the punch? Cheers, Mario. Right, to explain what this means, if you are in a left stance, an orthodox stance, and you step forward into a southpaw stance while punching with your left hand, that's a shift with the, what has become the rear hand. That's what we call a cheat punch, because the what would be the jab becomes the straight or the cross or whatever you want to call it. If you are stepping from an orthodox stance into a southpaw stance and you hit with the right hand, that's a same side shift punch thing. Terminology. The more specific things you get into, the harder it is to develop terminology for it. But that's what we're talking about. Mainly, the thing is that against an orthodox opponent, if you're orthodox and you step in to a southpaw stance with the left hand shooting out, your left hand is your jabbing hand, and that's the one that takes up the center line normally as you're matched up against someone else in a boxing or kickboxing stance. So it sneaks through a lot easier, and then you're loading up your right hand by turning your hips into your left hand. So your lead hand is basically you're set up for a right hook from your southpaw stance. If you're orthodox versus orthodox, and you step forward with your right hand, the path of the right hand doesn't change. Like, it's still coming in over the opponent's shoulder, and their forearm is normally in the way most of the time. So basically, it's a lot harder to sneak through, and you're stepping into that new stance, probably landing on their guard, and then you're standing in a new position almost on top of them where they're going to throw punches back. So really, when we talk about same-side hand shifts, for me personally, it's more to do with when you're going in an open guard matchup and you're shifting when you're in a closed guard matchup, like orthodox versus orthodox, and you're shifting into the right foot forward. If you're southpaw versus orthodox, so if you're the southpaw and you shift forward and punch with your left hand, you can line that up a bit better, especially if you circle right before you do it. It's really a case of lines and angles. The main concern with almost any punch is how does it relate to that opponent's lead shoulder? You know, you want to be hitting towards the open side or down the center line between the hands. You don't really want to be going over that shoulder or forearm. And the danger with most shifts generally is messing up your balance or standing on top of them. And I've always felt like, me personally, but whenever I've done a shift on the same hand and side, if you're on top of the opponent there, I always feel a bit more open than if I'm hitting them with my rear hand and then I'm ready to come back behind my lead shoulder again. But like I said, it's a personal thing. There have been guys who've shifted with the same hand. It's a little bit rarer, but Prince Nazim did it a lot. But then again, he was another guy who threw himself off balance a lot and also ended up too close a lot of the time. Again, it's an experimentation thing. There's only really principles in martial arts. Like, there's not really a wrong, because you can do even the wrong things in a way. You know, if you do them at the right time or you do the right thing before you do them, you can still make them work. So when we say that sort of stuff, it's more general. I mean, I would love to see more guys playing with that idea of same side shifting. The other thing is that a lot of guys tend to overcommit on that lead hand when they shift into it, because if you're like jabbing with your lead hand, you'll flick it out and bring it back ready to counter. If you're stepping into that jab, it becomes like a lunge punch, and a lot of guys tend to lean with it. Shinya Aoki did like a stepping elbow against Eddie Alvarez and just got countered and knocked out. I may be remembering that wrong, but I seem to remember it was a shifting elbow. Anyway, cheers, Mario. Hi, Jack. Massive fan of the podcast and the book so far. Oh, so far. Ooh, wouldn't read that last chapter. It's going to upset you, especially if you're really pro Mayweather McGregor. Conor McGregor and Max Holloway have both improved immensely since they first met, probably more so than any other fighters in the division. If McGregor were to return to featherweight and fight Holloway, what do you see going differently from the first fight? Outside of McGregor, who do you think is the biggest challenge for Max going forward? Cheers, Ed. I mean, really, the chances of Conor McGregor going back to featherweight, it would mean something went very wrong, because he is in a position where he is outside of the usual goings-on of the UFC. He doesn't have to fight. He doesn't have to defend a title. He doesn't have to defend the lightweight title. If he gets this Mayweather fight, don't expect him to fight in MMA ever again. It's like more money than anyone will ever see in the fight game. So if he comes back to featherweight, that means something's gone wrong for him. Or maybe when he loses this Mayweather fight, he takes 3 years off and then gets the itch to come back and wants Holloway's belt or something like that. But, you know, aside from how that could happen, I'm really interested in the rematch because Max has improved a lot. Well, it's just vague to say improved, but McGregor in the first fight, even before the knee injury, which resulted in him taking the fight to the ground and fighting there, was fighting very unusually for Conor McGregor. He was dealing with a guy with long, he's a long, well, rangy rather than long. He's a tall guy with a decent reach who uses his boxing a lot. McGregor was using the jamming sidekick to the lead knee. If you watch that fight, he does it more than any other fight, like basically more than any other time in his career. The total sidekicks to the lead leg by Conor McGregor, most of them come in that fight versus Max Holloway. So he's jamming that, stopping Max from stepping in and out, and making Max stand back. And then he starts moving Max towards the fence and jumping with like the lead uppercut to the left straight, or the jumping switch kick and getting the left straight in as he lands. He was doing all these interesting things that kept Max at distance, and then using like the kicks to close the distance rather than just coming in on him. And certainly there wasn't wasn't nearly as much sitting back and waiting to counter as he often does. In fact, he was scarcely looking for the counter at all. He was really actually getting in Max's face, which was quite interesting. To me, that fight is very unique in like the canon of Conor McGregor fights. Now, the interesting thing is that since that fight, Max has shown the sidekick a bit. He's shown how to deal with it a couple of times. No one's really gone to it with much effectiveness against him, but Pettis showed a few. Actually, Pettis hit him with some good sidekicks to the body, which was interesting. So it'd just be interesting to see, what changed in the rematch, because I don't think McGregor would go to the same thing again. I don't think he'd get away with doing the same thing again, because Max has a really good team around him who build him up specifically for his opponents. If you saw him against Aldo or anyone, actually, he just seems to really know the specifics of what his opponent's going to bring. I mean, I don't want to linger on this one too long because I don't think there's any chance of this fight happening. I think if we buy Mayweather versus McGregor, we don't deserve this fight. But I'd really love to see that fight. I think more kicking from Max would be important, and I would also like to see what he could do if that side kick does start coming in. If he could, fade away from it or withdraw the lead leg into the stance and throw the kicks back afterwards. Really interested to see that. Cheers, Ed. I'm running out of time now. I did say that I wouldn't cover the Holm versus Correia super fight this weekend. I mean, I'll cover it again I'll recap it on Monday and anything else interesting that happens in that. If you're a Patreon boy, make sure to check out the Great Depression Hodgepodge episode that went up a couple of weeks ago. If you want to join the Patreon, go and do it, because we're going to be doing a Sakuraba/Pride Grand Prix episode soon. And also it helps me do the podcast and my commentaries. If you have questions for the podcast, send them to fightsgonebypodcast@gmail.com. I'm your boy Jack Slack. Sorry it's been a bit short this week, but I'm your boy Jack Slack. This has been the Fights Gone By podcast. Cheers.